let's go ahead and just dive into our subject tonight. We're going to be talking about Christian Science and how this practice of Christianity helps us find healing in our individual lives as well as in regard to the issues that we're all thinking about in the world right now. We want to make the big ideas we're talking about just as practical as possible. So we will be exploring really in practical terms how these ideas have had an impact in people's lives and how we can face the stuff that seems pretty tough, complex, sometimes, even without a solution, and be led forward, finding the kind of ideas that really make a difference. I'm going to just jump right in and tell you a couple stories right off the bat. Normally, as we go along, I'm going to pause and explain words like God and spirituality and healing because they're just big words that mean a lot of different things to folks. First two stories, though, I'm just going to tell them to you as I experience them, and then we'll go back and unpack and explain them a bit. So the first story is from a few years ago when I was at a really large conference. It was a multi-day long conference over the course of the better part of a week. There were thousands of people there, and it had all gone really quite well, and I think folks were happy about everything until we got to the very last session, which was a Q&A period with the organizers of the event. In that Q&A period, somebody asked a question that turned out to be fairly controversial. It wasn't something that I was particularly passionate about, pro or con. It wasn't on my radar a lot. But what happened when the first organizer tried to answer the question is that it seemed to just create further frustration and confusion. And so the second organizer took a stab at it, and that only seemed to escalate things. There was about a handful of people up there, and the third and the fourth organizer each then took their turn with it. And it just seemed to get worse and worse and really snowball. At some point, by the time the fourth organizer was done trying to answer something from their point of view, it had gone to the point where I think you could describe it as mob mentality. The frustration that seemed to be just amongst a few people in the beginning had really spread to the whole audience, with folks, including me, starting to think thoughts like, why aren't these people addressing this issue head on? What are they trying to hide? Or, why aren't they being straightforward? And the irritation turned into just flat out anger, and in some cases, maybe in fury. If you've ever been to a game where people go around and, do the wave, it was a little like just this wave of anger, although it was involuntary and it certainly wasn't happy. When the fifth organizer stood up and took a turn at it, this woman, she just approached it from a whole different level. Now, this is somebody that I've met since then, and she's a Christian Scientist. And so I know she was praying about things. We'll come back as I return to the story later and talk a little bit about what things looked like from her point of view. From my point of view, what I remember most is that she talked about love. I don't remember what she said. I just remember that it was about love, and more than anything, I remember that I felt love. She stood there and just the whole atmosphere shifted really fast. As she talked about this bigger sense of love, it was like somebody took a pin in this huge inflated balloon and put it in, although just not with a violent pop, but with a very fast, like, whoosh, just the air went out of it, and this calm and clarity and normalcy came back to this audience. Now, as a member of the audience, I remember being impressed by that feeling of love, but it wasn't until the whole thing deflated that I realized how swept up in it I'd been. And talking to some other people later, I think they very much had the same kind of experience. We didn't realize we were caught up in it until we weren't caught up in it anymore. And what I distinctly remember thinking to myself is, if there's such a thing as mass hypnotism, that's it. Because this whole room was just caught up in this intense mentality, really not thinking, even though it felt like we were thinking, until we kind of woke up from the thing and realized, wow, that's, like I said in the beginning, it wasn't even something I was passionate about, and yet I was caught up in the mob mentality. So that was a wake-up call, but it was also pretty cool to see the way something so simple as a clear view of love expressed through love could make such a rapid difference among so many people so quickly. We'll pause that story. Again, we'll come back to it, but let me tell you the second story, and then we'll start tying all this together with our big ideas for today. The second story is on a much more micro level, and it's, again, a few years ago, I got a call in my role as a Christian Science practitioner. Now that means that I accept calls or communications from people who are reaching out, asking for help from a spiritual point of view. I pray with people and help people find those spiritual views that make a tangible difference in terms of their health and well-being and just any aspect of life. Well, this time I got a call from a young woman who was the mother of 3 children and was on a road trip, also with her husband. They'd been driving across country in the United States, and they were about halfway through their trip and had arranged to stop over and stay with a family member. When they arrived at that family member's house, the family member told them, this is her sister, that she and all her family had come down with the flu, and it was a few days before. They were mostly doing better at that point, but just let her know that the family was kind of on the mend at that point. The woman who called me decided that she and the family would stay that night, hang out during the day, and spend the night, and then get in their minivan and leave the next day and head on with their road trip. Well, they had a pretty good day, but around the time they were going to bed, all of the family members in her immediate family reported that they weren't feeling well. Each of the 3 little kids, mom and dad too, just feeling what the mom described as the almost unmistakable kind of symptoms that she had felt many times before, right before she was really not well the next day. And she was obviously concerned for everyone's well-being and, of course, for the road trip too, and just asked if we could pray together. One of the thoughts that came to mind as we were talking things out a little was a line from the Bible where St. Paul, who's talking to a whole group of people from very diverse backgrounds and trying to describe the nature of God from his point of view, talks about God as, this being in whom we live and move and have our being. And elsewhere in the Bible, another student of Jesus talks about God as love. A guy named in the book of John says God is love. So we brought these 2 ideas together, and we talked about how love then, as really a name for God, a divine love, is ever present, meaning, like Paul was describing it, it's within this love that we live and move and have our being. It's everywhere. It's the very atmosphere that surrounds us. And it has power. It's the source of our... A little bit about the implications of that and how she and the kids and the dad could all really feel that. And that they could know that they never left that atmosphere and walked into some other kind of atmosphere which had more power to define their health and well-being than that love did. So I think she felt somewhat comforted by those ideas, and we hung up the phone, and then I did more of the prayer work from the standpoint of Christian Science practice, which again, we're going to just unpack here in a few minutes. Well, the next morning she called me and she said, the kids are already in the minivan. Dad's putting the last few pieces of luggage in. I just want to tell you, we're all feeling great. She said, the kids are bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and none of those oncoming symptoms are present anymore, and certainly it hasn't developed into anything worse. She said, on the one hand, it feels like a total miracle because I've never felt that one day and felt totally fine the next day. And she said, on the other hand, it just feels totally natural. It feels just like us. We're all feeling fine. We're feeling ourselves. And she expressed gratitude, and I did too, and they went on with their road trip, and I know that the rest of the trip went very well and that everybody stayed feeling healthy. Okay, so we're going to pause that story now too and just talk about a common element here in both of those stories that relates to our theme of spiritual discovery and how we better the world. And the key word there is prayer. In both of those stories, I maybe didn't mention it, but the woman on the stage was definitely praying. And that family and I were praying together that night. So let's just talk about that for a second. What is prayer? In the Bible, some of Jesus' disciples come and ask him, according to one of the accounts in the Bible, how do you pray? And in that section of the Bible, it says that Jesus responded that first you need to go into your closet. And the context around that is he talks about how prayer is not this outward thing. It's not something you do for other people. It's not about a show. Go to a place where it's just between you and God, and it's not about all the surface level stuff going on. I think by extension, we could also say that it's not just about not what other people think about what we're doing, but maybe it's even about taking a step back a bit from our own fears and our own preconceived notions about things and knee-jerk reactions to things, as well as the opinions and the reactions of others around us. Take a step back from that for a moment. And then Jesus gives what many Christians today call the Lord's Prayer. We're not going to talk about all that, but in essence, the Lord's Prayer talks a little bit about God's nature and about our relationship with God and about what that means for us. So if we were to look at this broad brushstroke, when Jesus is asked, how do you pray? He says, go into your closet, take that step back from the fear and the reaction and the opinions and just the surface appearance of things, and get focused on the nature of God and on our relationship with God. Okay, so the step back part maybe makes sense, but let's talk about the second part of that. What is God? If we're supposed to get focused on the nature of God and our relationship with God, what is God and what does that mean about us? So just in a few quick moments here, a couple things the Bible says. One, we already talked about how in the New Testament, from a writer in the book of John, 1 John, it says that God is love. Well, the Bible also says that God is life itself and that God is truth itself. In fact, the Bible says that everything that was made by God, and nothing was made that God didn't make. It says that God is pure good, and that the same fountain doesn't send forth both fresh water and salty water. So God is life itself. God is the source of all that is good and true, and that is actually what is fundamental. That is what's natural. Talks about God as really the cause, the maker of everything. You could say the principle of the universe in the sense of God being, what undergirds and governs and shapes everything that, again, is natural and normal. One way that Jesus talked about God is as spirit. And spirit can sound like a pretty abstract word. And so it's helpful maybe to just understand spirit's a translation in English from a word that actually in the Greek, which is the language in which the New Testament was written, and in the Hebrew, which is the language in which the Hebrew scriptures, or what Christians call the Old Testament, were written. And in both Hebrew and Greek, the root word for spirit is actually the same, and it just means wind. It's a word that is literally translated in some parts of the Bible as spirit and in other parts of the Bible as wind or as breath. And so when Jesus talks about God as spirit, in one part, he even talks about, you don't know where the wind's going to come from and where the wind's going to go. And indicates, you can see the leaves moving in the trees, even though you can't see the wind. The implication, I think, being you can't see God, but you can see the effect of God. God, like the very air, is everywhere. God, like life itself, is like our breath. Maybe not something we think about a whole lot, certainly not something we really see, but something you'd know it if it wasn't there really fast. You'd be aware of that. And so it's in God that we live and move and have our being. A love that is really ever present. And something we don't see, but we see the effect of it. Well, that's true about love as well. We don't see love, but we see love made manifest in acts of kindness and generosity and patience. We see truth not as a thing, but expressed in tangible acts of integrity and honesty, and so forth, right? So God is not something we see, but is everywhere, is the root, the cause, the source of all that is fundamental and real and good. This is a concept of God that's built throughout the Bible. There are certainly other things in the Bible that don't sound like that sound more like God is a tribal leader that favors some and not others, and destroys some and helps others, that sometimes sends bad in order to achieve some long-term good. But I think what we see in the Bible is an evolution of the people's idea of God. Sometimes it seems like there's contradictions when you talk about a God that is pure good, is life itself, and it can't send forth both fresh water and salty water. In other words, life can't send death and destruction. It would be contrary to the nature of life. Good can't send forth terribleness and injustice. So if you read it just as all things being equal, then it looks like there's contradictions. But if you read it as a story that is also our story and is the story of just everybody, of how ideas evolve, how we learn, how we get clearer, how the experiences of the people related in the Bible over this long period of time help them learn and understand the nature of God until it gets clearer and clearer and clearer, and really culminates in the life of Jesus, who gives us the clearest sense of God's nature and what it means for our lives. So when we talk about God tonight, we're talking about this description that we've already kind of unpacked, with God being life and truth and love. Okay, so one last part of this before we really start to apply it all. What does that mean about us? If that's what God is, then how does that connect to who we are, and especially to all the stuff we seem to see that looks very contrary to that? Well, the first thing the Bible says about who we are is really on page 2, and it lays out a really interesting foundation. It says that we're made in the very likeness of God, the very likeness of love itself and of life and truth itself. And that's not a one-off statement. It pops up all throughout really the Hebrew scriptures and into the New Testament and those who followed Jesus even after he was gone. Jesus, for example, said, "Be perfect as God is perfect." A follower of Jesus, Paul, again, wrote a letter saying, "Put off this old sense of who you are and put on the new man, which is created to be like God." There's one last thing I'm going to read you that ties in with that. This is from the Hebrew prophet Isaiah. Same basic idea, but I love the poetry of this. And Isaiah's writing as if it's God talking to us, and says, "Bring my sons from far away and my daughters from the end of the earth, everyone who's called by my name, whom I've created for my glory, whom I've formed and made." So first of all, called by my name, in the Bible, the word name means nature or authority. So that's the power behind who and what we are. Sons from far, daughters from the ends of the earth. It's clearly a statement about absolutely everybody equally. And then formed and made by God. Well, if we're talking about a God that is the kind of God we're describing, that sounds good. And then there's this great purpose word right there, which is, or phrase, created for my glory. Well, to be created for the glory of something, to glorify something, means to make something known. That's one of the definitions. And we could make God known by going out on the street and talking about God. We could even do things in the name of God. But this isn't talking about what we say or what we do. It's talking about who we are. It's talking about our very being. So we exist for the glory of God. We exist to make God known. Well, that to me corresponds with the idea that you don't see God, but you see the effect of God. And that's us then. We're the effect of God. If we're made in the likeness of God, as it was saying a few different times in the Bible in different ways, then we can't see love, but we can see love expressed. We can see love made manifest. We can see love in actions and truth and all that is good, all that is beautiful, all that is right, and all that is balanced, and all that is just. It means that we are made to be free. We're made to be whole and healthy. We're made peaceable. We're made purposeful. We're made valuable. We're made hopeful. Just any good quality or characteristic is built into our spiritual DNA. Not in cookie cutter kind of ways. The source is infinite, which means there is an infinite variety of unique expressions of it. And so that would be us, made in the very likeness of God, made for God's glory, made to make God known. Love on legs, so to speak. You and me, and actually everybody, everywhere. And here's where then we come to that last part of the question, which is, how in the world does this connect? I don't necessarily feel like the glory of God every moment. I certainly don't feel like that's what's showing up on my news alerts on my phone throughout the day. When it dings and I look down, it's not, oh, there's a little more glory of God. And there's some more glory of God happening over there. So how do these big ideas that seem to be at the root of so much in the Bible actually connect with daily life? And so then that brings us really to our title, Spiritual Discovery. First of all, the word spiritual comes from the word spirit. So if God is spirit, then that which is spiritual is that which comes from God. So a spiritual perspective is a God-like perspective, a perspective rooted in God's nature. To say that we are spiritual is to come back to that idea that we come from God. We are the outcome of God, the effect of God, of truth and life and love and all that is good. So spiritual discovery then is a discovery of something rooted in God's nature. Well, what does that mean? Going back to the Bible, first of all, probably a lot of you tuned in today know something about the Bible, love the Bible. There may be other folks here that don't know it, or that aren't interested in it at this point because of the way you feel folks have beat you or other people over the head with that book. So just so we're all kind of looking at this as, why are we talking about this as such an important, source of all our information? The Bible, in just really practical terms, is, it's not just one book. It's a lot of stories, history, poems, letters from men, women, rich, poor, people with different ideas about God over a very long period of time. But there's some common threads. And this idea of spiritual discovery, I think, is something we see running throughout it. We see people in all the dire straits that humanity can face, whether it's in the middle of war, in the middle of famine, in the middle of oppression and injustice, sick and incurable. And yet in these situations, we see again and again with this whole variety of people from different walks of life that when they turn to some idea that's their clearest sense of what God is and are inspired by that, are uplifted by that, it in some way shapes their view, their thinking of things. And that spiritual perspective, that way of looking out on the world, starting with a sense of what God's nature is and the implications of that, it brings them comfort, and it shows them how to take steps forward that are really practical. In the middle of war, they find safety. In the middle of a famine, they find food, they find water. Outcast from society, they find community, connections again, family. Considered incurable, they find health and wholeness again. So there's this cause and effect relationship that we see in the middle of tough stuff. Someone turns to this deeper idea of God, and in whatever way it reshapes their view, there's then this tangible effect that comes from that. Now, a lot of times when folks talk about spirituality today, they talk about it in the best case scenario as a kind of, way of learning about what's going to help you get good later on, like maybe even another lifetime, or something that gives you a positive attitude right now and gives you comfort as you work through the trials and tribulations and struggles of daily life, keeps you going, a kind of sense of a positive attitude rooted in some ideas about God. Or on the other end of the spectrum, that's not as nice, it's talked about more as just sticking your head in the sand. ignoring issues, being impractical. You may have heard the phrase, religion is the opiate of the masses. And so I would say, though, that in the Bible, we don't really see any of that, either on the kind of positive or negative end of that spectrum, because all of that basically says that spirituality is just, in one form or another, either some delayed benefit or just different forms of kind of positive thinking, a way to have a better attitude when you go through life, knowing that someday things will turn out well. But again, what we see in the Bible is different. There's this often very immediate effect, and even if the effect is not immediate, there are immediate practical ideas, footsteps that lead to really big, fundamental, long-term change. And so that's what I feel is at the root of what we want to explore. That's what I feel is going on in those first two stories that I told you, and in some of the stuff we're going to talk about in a moment. I would call that discovery, and discovery is different than just positive thinking. Positive thinking, it means you have a good attitude, but it doesn't change a whole lot. Discovery is what has progressed humanity throughout human history. I think we can put a lot of things under that umbrella of discovery. Certainly, we talk about things like aerodynamics, people discovering them, then being able to build a plane. We know about the Wright brothers in the U.S., and of course there were others around the world, Santos Dumont from Brazil, and others who were understanding the laws of aerodynamics all around the same time, and each of them building on that understanding the best they could. Well, not one of these people just went up to a tall hill and thought positively about flying and jumped off and hoped it worked out. Discovery is not about positive thinking. It's about comprehending something that's actually already there. You can't discover it if it doesn't already exist. And so it also shows, though, that there's a mental journey in discovery. It's not something that we often see first. In other words, we didn't first see planes flying through the sky and then discover the laws of aerodynamics. It was a concept, but a concept that was rooted in something actual laws of the way things work. And the more those laws were understood, the more somebody could build something with it. There was a tangible effect. It had nothing to do with whether somebody had a positive attitude or a terrible attitude. It had to do with what the law was and building on that law and what happens. Well, I think we could say that about other things. Maybe it's easier to understand when you talk about something like, aerodynamics. But when you talk about something like what has progressed humanity socially or politically, in terms of human rights, or really any other form of progress, I think we can still make that same correlation. I know that it's Women's History Month in Canada, and on behalf of this branch in West Vancouver, but we have our Women's History Month too, a different time of year. And something that occurred to me before is that when we look back at how women were viewed 100, 150 years ago, there were a lot of people who believed that women were literally less developed human beings, less developed men. And that was thought to be an actual thing, not just a nice view or a bad view, but a physiological, tangible kind of a thing. And then because of that view, we all know women were treated differently. The laws were, formed in different ways, applied unequally. Women were less educated in many cases, and so on. So if you just looked at the surface appearance of things, you could see people who seemed to be living on an unequal level, and then you could reason out from that surface appearance and say, well, see, clearly they're unequal. But the inequality is rooted in a misconception more than it is in an actuality. So what needs to change? Well, discovery. Discovery means discovering the equality, the wholeness that is already there. Really kind-hearted people, but rooted in the wrong idea of womanhood, wouldn't have been able to do a whole lot. That is, people who literally believed that women were less developed men and were just really nice folks who wanted to help these unequal people out. How far would they have gotten? Rooted in a misconception, just a flat-out lie like that, even with all the positive attitude and benevolence in the world, how much good would it have done? could they have created some formula or something to change those unequal people into equal people? It's not possible. So when we talk about prayer helping us take a step back for a minute and look beneath the surface appearance of things, get rooted in fundamental truths, which are maybe not always apparent on the surface, we're talking about discovery. We're talking about what humanity has always had to do when we have to not just judge by the way things look, but build on a concept that, if true, can be understood and applied, and then a new result can happen. We can build on that. So what happened was more people began to become conscious of and accept the fact that already existed, in essence, discover it for themselves, that there was more equality than they had recognized before, than that they had been taught, maybe even than they felt they had seen playing out. As they built more on that truth, things started to change. The laws started to be reformed to better reflect what was already true. Now, we're not done with this, but this is how we progress, not by looking at the surface appearance and accepting that at face value. So there's really nothing unusual when we talk about this. Is not about burying heads in the sand, and it's not about impracticality, because again, it can sound like, you want to think about this positive stuff that's not at all related to what the world's dealing with. But I think what the Bible tends to show us is that actually it's very related, and that if we only bounce around on the surface level logic that we've been given, we're not going to get that far. We actually have to discover something that's contrary to the way things appear to be. And then we have to act on it. There has to be some result that gets proved from what's discovered there. One more thing from that surface level logic example: if I wrote 7 plus 3 equals on the board, my imaginary board, and you would all know that 7 plus 3 equals what? 73? No. 10? Yes, of course. And how do you know? Well, because you've been taught the principle of math and you've proved it for yourself. But what if you didn't know the principle? What if all you had was surface level logic? What if somebody told you the plus means you put them together? And so you looked at it and you went 7 and 3 together, 73. Well, you'd be wrong. And if you did your math that way, it would cause suffering. When you go to do your grocery shopping, when you go to check up on your bank account, you just would not get very far with that math, and it would make things uncomfortable. And I would say, in essence, that's what we face in so many circumstances, is a surface level logic, that as we take a step back and understand a deeper principle on which we can reason and get better results, then the suffering eases and more natural harmony is experienced. So let's look back at that story about the family who called. The surface level logic was, you walk into this atmosphere, it's contagious, you may catch it. You've certainly experienced that before. It's not just make-believe. You've had those feelings. You the next day felt not well. Don't tell me that's make-believe stuff. Like I've seen it with my own eyes, and so have many other people. Well, but what if it's a 7 plus 3 equals 73 kind of a logic? What if, we see it, and we've reasoned from it plenty of times before, just like we've reasoned that women are unequal, or we've reasoned, that there's no such thing as human flight. And we continue to suffer from that. We continue to experience the effects of that logic. But what happens if then that family discovers something new? What if there's a breakthrough in thinking where it becomes a little more evident that actually it's in God that we live and move and have our being? Actually, that's what defines my health. That's what defines how I'm going to feel tomorrow. That's what defines the family who's here. That's actually the principle of how things work. That's what's most natural. Well, I would say that's what happened. And that the effect of that was more harmony. The suffering of the 7 plus 3 equals 73 kind of math wasn't there the next day, because we were reasoning from a more accurate sense of who and what we are and how things are made to be. And that shift in thought was not just positive thinking, it actually led to tangible results, because it was discovering something already there. actually true. And then the experience followed when they built on the true idea. Yeah, it was a mental shift, but it had tangible effect. Just as any other mental shift that we've talked about in these other examples cause really literal, tangible benefits, even though the journey was first and foremost a mental one. So looking back at the other story, and we'll keep going with these stories a little bit here too, but I would say that's kind of what was going on from this woman's standpoint, who on the stage steps out, and let's just put ourselves in her shoes for a minute, looks out over a sea of angry faces, mob mentality, and maybe looking like these folks are about to storm the stage. And the surface level logic would say, that's tough. That's scary stuff. What do you do? My previous friends and colleagues just didn't get anywhere with that. What could I possibly say or do? And yet it seems like she was reasoning from a different basis. She had to have mentally taken a step back from the surface appearance of things. Certainly not buried her head in the sand, but actually opened her eyes more to a principle that was governing everybody equally, just like every principle does. There's no such thing as a principle that is like mine and yours. It's just 7 and 3 equals 10 for everybody. So she looked out and she saw these individuals made in the likeness of God. She saw something of everybody in that room's inherent peace, inherent ability to think clearly and not to be swept up in mob mentality, to feel embraced by love, that everybody was built to experience that and had a rapport with love and couldn't be dominated by something else or swept up in a mentality apart from that love that really had the full authority over that room, that day, what was going on, the hearts, the character of everybody there. She had to have looked out and seen something to that effect and then built on that logic, expressed it. She didn't cause it. It was already there. Her words were a reflection of what was already true. Her actions, her perspective was built on that. And it had a tangible effect. It was a little bit like somebody just opening the blinds in a room and the light comes in. It doesn't matter how many people are in the room. Wherever the light goes, it lights it up. What we were experiencing was a kind of darkness. It was a confusion. It was wrong. It wasn't rooted in anything true. It wasn't even rooted into the kind of thinking that was natural to like my perspective and a lot of other people's perspective there. And so it wasn't that we became people we weren't when this woman stood up and helped. It was more that we woke up to who we already were. So when we talk about discovery, it's what is already there. And I would say healing in the Bible, as well as in, lives lived today and ever since Bible times, that's what it's about. Healing is not just about coping with problems. It's not about miracles, meaning the natural course of things is like this and some far off deity enters in and hooks some people up with good if you say the right thing or join the right group or read the right book. But it's actually the uncovering or the waking up to what is really normal for everybody. And what's normal flows out from this nature of God that's described in the Bible. It's something that people have experienced again and again and again, even when the surface level logic just said, there is no other way to look at this. This is a tough situation. Now, when I tell that second story about that family, I feel like, especially in today's environment, it's worth really pausing for a second and pointing out that you could hear all that and you could say to yourself, does that mean somebody reasoning out from that perspective is just going to ignore the community around them, especially when we're talking about a pandemic, that people are going to, just kind of say, well, I live in the atmosphere of love and that's it. And it doesn't matter what you all think. But it helps to go back to really the source of what we're talking about, which was Jesus' teachings, and to see that the golden rule is actually also the outgrowth of Jesus' teachings. They're not in conflict with one another. Jesus didn't create the golden rule. It's expressed in text before his time and by other folks, but it was certainly part of what he was teaching too. And so the idea that as one reasons out from a sense of God's power, that doesn't lead one to be in conflict with society. Quite the opposite. It leads folks to a sense of responsibility, to a sense of civic duty, to a sense of real seriousness in dealing with issues that impact individuals and communities, and a real thoughtfulness in how to navigate that in the most intelligent and useful and healing, proactively healing kind of ways. It means that there's not a reason to be afraid, but that fearlessness doesn't lead to a lack of responsibility. So how that plays out for people is completely individual. There's no way to look at that and say, well, that means you will always do this. It means it informs you in how to think most constructively. Somebody reasoning out from this basis wouldn't be anti-vaccine, for example, because that would mean there's fear. There's a fear that if I get forced to do that, I'll be hurt or the society will be hurt. Nor would they be afraid of not having it, because it would, not be starting from the standpoint of, well, where do I really find the most reliable sense of health and well-being? But with fearless thinking leads then, again, the most constructive individual choice to think through, what does that mean for me? What does it mean for my neighbor? What does it mean? How do I work together with everyone and, follow the guidelines as they need to be? If there's laws, follow those laws. I'm not afraid of any of that. Not trying to prevent anyone else from something that they feel is going to help them. But I'm going to, from this clearest, most fearless basis, be able to make individual choices as to what genuinely feels like the best method possible. Not a dogmatic choice, but just whatever is genuinely the most practical for me, for those around me, and just step by step be reasoning that through each day. And that's what you see happening with that family. There's no dogma involved. It was just, it became very clear what was most fundamental and true, and that shifted their experience. So the question behind all this, maybe as we get to the last 15 or so minutes here, and I want to tell you one or two more little stories and just touch on a few other ideas, is how. How does this work? And so coming back to Jesus and how Jesus showed us something really unique about grace. And in a short phrase, we could say grace is the unearned love of God. And of course, it's unearned if it's already there. You don't have to earn something that already exists. You don't have to create it. You don't have to work your way up to it. It's something that you don't earn math principles. Math is already there. It applies equally. Jesus showed us something about the nature of salvation, which, again, in a really short phrase, may be that discovery that nothing can separate us from the love of God, and the steps that it takes to really experience that for ourselves and to help others do the same. Jesus showed us something about what real power is like, because people were looking for a military, a political leader, and his ideas, what he was rooted in, this big concept of God, it led him to meekness. It led him to a meekness that was mighty in its ability to help people in any walk of life and to be unquenchable by any of the stuff that, folks threw at him. Jesus showed the way for those around him to also understand God's nature more clearly and to follow in his footsteps in experiencing that more. That true idea of God that he shared, that he expressed, the presence and activity of God that just shone through his life, that's an ever-present thing. It didn't start when Jesus arrived, and it didn't go when Jesus went. That presence and activity of God is throughout all time. Again, it's like the very wind or the air that we breathe. It's ever-present. It's with each of us right here and now. It's that same love, that same truth that dawns on us, that wakes us up, that just dispels the darkness of fear, that shows the way forward in difficult circumstances. And that's what's just always here with all of us. And Jesus' life represented that. Whatever we face, be it the economic issues of today or of any other time, the kind of stalemates that seem to be out there where we look out and again, the news alerts just, it looks like, gosh, how are we ever going to make progress? Divisions in families, even churches, society, countries, that stuff that seems so entrenched, this bigger idea of God's nature really takes us by the hand. Again, it's called grace for a reason. It's not something we earn. It's something that comes to us when we're, yearning for something bigger in the face of what feels like stalemate and few options. And it opens the way. It shows us, gives us that idea that's out of the box. How do we move? What do we say? What do we do? Sometimes it's not even an outward action thing. It's a moment by moment thing where we take a step back, and our prayer gives us that feeling of, what does this nature of God mean for us right now? What does that mean for what I'm thinking about right now? What does it mean for the stuff I face just in this hour, just in this 10 minutes? And then 10 minutes later or an hour later or this evening, again, that same, okay, God, what does that look like? What are the implications? How does that reshape my view? How do I build on that? How do I walk the walk rooted in that idea? And that's the way. Jesus didn't call what he taught Christianity, talked about it as the way, just very simply. And later it was called Christianity, which is great. But it's that, just that idea that there is a way, and that way is open to anybody to walk in. And it's not about a denomination. It's not about doctrines and creeds. It's about what is genuinely practical, really reaching us right where we are. I think of it sometimes as the way the light of the sun is just shining. And it's not like God just enters into all these problems in humanity, but like kind of like the sun just shines. And you can't see it, but on the other side of this camera is a window. And if the light's coming through here in the early morning, as it does, the light will hit the floor, the couch over here, and it'll be in the exact shape of the window. I have all the little slat marks and everything. It's not that the light knows the shape of my window, but I experience it that way. I experience it just as if it did, because it's like it's tailor-made for the shape of my window. Well, that love of God, that truth, that intelligence, that is, we're not talking about an inert love. We're talking about a love that creates, a love that knows, a love that is active, a love that heals. Not because it's involved in human problems, but because divinity reaches humanity just wherever there's a crack in what we're dealing with and we're yearning for more. The light just shines through, and it shines through in a way that feels tailor-made for our issue, tailor-made for that moment, tailor-made for what we need to know. And we don't cause that. Our prayer is our tool for opening up to it, for listening to it, to bearing witness to its presence and what it's doing. The light is the power. The light is what, dispels the confusion, the anger, the feeling of hopelessness. And it says, no, there's a reason to hope. No, there is a way forward. Look at this. Sometimes it's in some action we're going to take, and sometimes it's in just reforming our view of others, a bit like that woman on the stage who was embracing like thousands of people in her prayer that day. And it had an effect. It had an effect for thousands of people, not because of her, but because of the way light works. When our prayer is embracing our world and the issues that our world faces, the light is shining through, and it's shining through in tailor-made ways that embrace everybody there, that help bring ideas to the surface, help heal divisions, help in the middle of stalemate just soften somebody's perspective and help them go, yeah, maybe there is another way. Maybe I don't need to just stand for this. This isn't working. This isn't achieving what I really care about. And we look at climate action and that kind of stuff. It's, what are the long-term innovative solutions, as well as what are the most immediate things we need to do now in the midst of sometimes emergencies that people are facing. It's tailor-made to human experience in every way we need it. But it's bigger than that. That's just how we experience it. We're turning to the highest, the clearest idea of that light, of God and God's presence and God's activity. And as we reason out from there, it the implications are, oh, I see how that applies to this, and I see how that it applies to that fear and that feeling of stalemate. And we need to do that. We need to bring those ideas and those fears into contact with that light. We need to be open and honest in our prayers in a way that allows it to speak to that and really let that light shine. Let those implications become clear so that the two aren't coexisting. Like, yeah, I believe this, but I also believe this. That's a dualistic view on life, and it's not that singular one God, one creator, one life view that Jesus was demonstrating. Bringing it all together under that one umbrella of what is true and good, and reasoning out from there is what opens the way to all of these, things that we have to think about. Mary Baker Eddy is the name of the woman who founded this movement of this practice of Christian Science. She lived in the 1800s, and she felt she discovered something. She called it Christian Science, or the science of Christ, and the idea of that is everything we've been talking about. It's that this is not about a new doctrine. It's about living it. It's not about somebody's view of it. It's just about, is it livable? Is it real? Is it the principle of the universe or not? And how did we better understand that? What helps explain that to us in a way that helps us walk in it and genuinely bring that to our lives and others' lives? It's all about practical living. She found healing in her life from chronic illness, from the effects of a severe accident. She broke through the expectations of many people around her. Whether it's the limitations of health or those societal views. Again, she lived in the 1800s, just into the beginning of the 1900s, and for everything we were just talking about, the kind of group think around women at that time, the kind of oppression, she had this higher idea of God's nature and what it means for us, and just operated there, reasoned out from that perspective again and again, step by step. She didn't call herself, anything other than a Christian. She wasn't, following this other. She didn't consider herself a feminist, for example. I'm not even sure that word existed at the time, but certainly there were other women pioneering in that way in that time. Her view, and she communicated with some of them, Clara Barton and Susan B. Anthony and others, and they had a great mutual respect. But her idea was, follow Christ, follow this true idea of God and what it means in our lives, and the rest is going to take care of itself, because you can't have injustice in that model. You can't have inequality in that model. You can't have anything that is unlike the nature of God in that model. So you don't have to strike out against the darkness so much as work out from the standpoint of the light and what is true, and watch how that moves through, and in the most intelligent and progressive ways helps us navigate the issues that we faced. She wrote prolifically. She wrote this book I'll talk about in a second called Science and Health: A Key to the Scriptures, that explains Christian Science. It's a book about the Bible. It's a book about how we live the Bible in our daily lives and really experience it. She spoke publicly at a time when it was literally considered immoral for a woman to speak in public. She pioneered copyright law. She was a philanthropist, and she helped and healed people. And what people learned from what she was learning helped them heal themselves and other people. And then those folks helped heal other people. It's been a grassroots movement from the beginning. It has to be that way, because if you have a hierarchy, then you have this structure where God is distant. If you have a science, then you have every single person with the same access and the same right, and even the same necessity to understand that right and what is true, and to act on it. This science of Christ, this movement around that has just for quite a while now helped people experience more of God's nature in their lives, and again, to help and to heal others. Mary Baker Eddy felt that this is something Jesus promised as she was looking at what she was learning and how it was helping her live practically and helping others. And then looking at Scripture, which says, Jesus says, whoever follows me will do the works that I do. and even promised that, it would be natural to be led into all truth and to understand what Jesus had said, not just have a blind faith in it. Again, her book explains all of this, and the last 100 pages of the book are all stories of people who wrote in after reading the book and talked about how their lives were transformed. In many cases, most of them talking about how they were cured of something that was considered incurable and diagnosed as, too late, too far gone. But really shifts in lives and character. All of this is it's just not about a self-driven power. Hopefully that's clear at this point, because it's not about positive thinking. That is how I shape and hold on to the right thoughts and think the right things, and like it's me generated, as opposed to it's more about stepping back and recognizing what God is and what God is doing. That means even how how that informs our sense of our prayer and what it is. Do we create our prayers, or do the ideas that come to us come from God? Does even the desire to pray come from that divine love? Do we generate any of this ourselves, or is all of it grace? Is all of it that light that dawns on us, that moves us? When we see that that's what it is, it really helps us then as we pray, and the thought comes, well, can my prayers do enough? Or, does my prayers make a difference? Realize it's not really about me. It's about what truth is, and it's about what truth does. It's about the power of truth to destroy what is untrue. And of course it has that power. Of course that's natural. I'm going to read you 2 quick quotes, tell you one last quick story. I know we're right about our time, but we'll wrap up here just a couple minutes after the hour. Mary Baker already wrote in Science and Health here, the conceptions of mortal, erring thought must give way to the ideal of all that is perfect and eternal. Through many generations, human beliefs will be attaining diviner conceptions, and the immortal and perfect model of God's creation will finally be seen as the only true conception of being. Now she starts this last sentence with the word science. She's talking about the science of Christ. She says it reveals the possibility of achieving all good and sets mortals at work to discover what God has already done. So all of those feelings of burden and personal responsibility and stuff when it comes to finding this way and experiencing it, all of that gets to be brought into the light of, no, but wait, what is God doing? What is that intelligence of the universe causing? What is the source of all right ideas doing right here and right now? How is that light breaking through in just the way that I need it right now, in the way that defines everything about who I am and how I think, and all those other folks out there? And this brings me to the last story I want to tell you, because looking out at the world around us and folks that seem to not be too receptive, or caught up in views that we think are not so good, and then many times are hurting others. And then that feeling also, what good can my prayers do? Do I know enough to pray or to benefit anybody? That's the purpose of this very last story. So I was in high school in this story, and I had an acquaintance who I connected with because I'd see him walking to school, and I at some point offered him a ride, especially on a rainy day. And so we became kind of friends. We didn't hang out a whole lot, but once in a while we did after school. But mostly he lived pretty close to me, and he would walk over to my house in the mornings in order for me to take him to school on a rainy day in particular, because I had a car and I was driving and he didn't. Well, he came from a not so good family. There was a lot of difficulty there, and I know he liked coming into a little bit more stable environment when he came to my house. But one morning he came really early, and he didn't ring the doorbell like he usually did. He walked around the side of the house and knocked on my window to my room. I got up and I let him in, and he didn't say a whole lot. He said, "I'm sorry, I'm early. I just need to get out." And I said, "Okay, well, why don't you hang out here and I'll go get ready, and then we can grab a bowl of cereal and go to school." And so I grabbed my stuff and I went to the bathroom, and then I realized I'd forgotten something. So I came back out and went into my room, and he was sitting in a chair there, but he had a knife out, and he'd been running that knife up and down his arm, and he had some good scratches there. But as soon as I came in the room, he folded the knife up and he put it in his pocket, and I was kind of looking at him like, what's going on? And he said, oh, don't worry, I was just messing around. I probably did it harder than I should have. It's no big deal. And being a high school student, I didn't really know. I felt a bit helpless. I didn't feel like I knew what to say or how to handle that situation. I asked him again, are you sure you're okay? And he deflected. And so I grabbed my things and I went back to the bathroom. And as I was taking my shower, though, this thought came to me just really strongly, like something's wrong. And I don't know what to do about it. So I really reached out in prayer. And I can't say I feel like I knew a lot about prayer at that point, but the idea of reaching out was the idea of really yearning for something bigger, a bigger idea, a sense of a love that I could count on, that would give me some perspective that would be helpful in knowing what to do next. And as I stood there and yearned for that and reached out and tried to think a little bit about, what I knew about God's nature, suddenly this really overwhelming sense of just pure, powerful, ever-present love just kind of filled the space. And what I remember feeling was that love is right there with him. I don't have to know what's going on. I don't have to be there. It's there. Love is there. Love is embracing him. Love is communicating with him. Love is uplifting him. Love is just giving him absolutely everything he needs right now. And there's no room for anything else. There's no room for whatever might be going on there that I don't know. I don't know what's there. But whatever it is, if it's not like God's nature, the power of love and the ideas of love, that is intelligent ideas and safe ideas and useful ideas, they have the floor. They have the dominance. They have the control in his life, and not other thoughts that would seem to be his or that would come out of things, he's experienced or fears or misconceptions. And I felt this real peace. I felt convinced that that's actually what was there. I felt like I discovered it. I don't think I would have used the word at the time, but it was like, oh, it's there. Okay. I felt like I actually saw what was going on. And with that piece, I didn't think about it again. I finished getting ready, and by the time I went back into the room to get him, he was in the chair still, and he was asleep. So I woke him up, and we had our bowl of cereal, and we got in the car and we left. And as we were driving to school, he said to me, I have to tell you something. And I said, okay. And he said, I want to tell you that I came to your house this morning to commit suicide. He said, I was going to do it when you weren't in the room. And I wanted to do it at your house because I feel a calm here. And I feel peaceful here. And I felt like if I was going to go, I wanted to go in that kind of an environment. Then he described to me how he was going to do it and how there's ways you can do it where you can't be saved and all that kind of stuff. But he said, something happened after you came in and then you left and I got the knife back out and I was going to do it. He said, all of a sudden, I felt really loved. And he said, I can't explain it much, but I can tell you that all that desire to do that is gone now. And he said, you don't have to worry about me. I promise you. I'm never going to do that. He said, I just feel differently now, and I'm really grateful. And I was just quiet. I didn't know really what to say, but I was really grateful too. And I expressed that gratitude with him, and then, the day went on. Well, he's still around today. We're not close, but I see him on Facebook and things, and I know he's doing fine. As we look out at the world and we think about everything we've talked about here today, and the power of discovery, spiritual discovery, that is, discovering what is already there in terms of what is rooted in God's nature and what God is and what God is doing. The way that gives us a sense of what prayer is and how we pray and what has the power. And the way it contradicts every thought that says, I'm not good enough, I don't know, because it's like that is nothing to do with what God is and what God is doing. that is grace when that dawns on us, that the power here is what God is and what God is doing. That it always has been the power, and that as people have perceived that in human history, it has brought change. As much as we still work through and have to work through in this world, the world is in a better place to every measurable scale by any Google it. It's like basically on pretty much every scale there is. We have got plenty of stuff to work through. That's the stuff of our time, but what moves humanity, what is uplifting thought, what is bringing the pathway forward, it's universal. And the way to see what it is and to follow that and be led by that and to let our actions be the outgrowth of it. And especially our thinking, to let our thinking reason out from that, be guided by that. And become free of the fears and the views of others out there who don't get it, and to uplift like it did me in that day, to see people in what is really moving them, what is really natural for them to be in tune with and to be moved by, to see that the things that seem to shape us and personalities and tradition and history, it doesn't squelch individuality and the richness of all the diversity of this world. But it does help the beauty and the goodness of that diversity come forward and become less and less hindered by the other stuff that seems woven in that only benefits some and oppresses others, or that seems to in some way victimize the world or the environment. What is bringing down greed and selfishness and short-sightedness and promoting useful views that don't just benefit some people, but all people, that bring us together in unified ways. That's what this is. That's what's going on. It's moving through humanity, and every single one of us is able to discover more of that. Again, even in those micro moments throughout our day, what do I think now? What do I need to know right now? How do I move on that now? It can feel like such a weight to think our prayer is about solving all the problems of the world, but it's really not. It's just about, what am I led to think about right now? What do I need to know right now? That's it. And that's enough, because that's our part. We get to bear witness to that. And if the love of the universe that is moving things forward gives us that to know, then that is all that we need to do our part. And moment by moment, that doesn't leave us in a small frame of mind. It expands our sense of what we can do and what's possible in the world. Prayer doesn't lead one person's views to dominate another person's views. It actually leads all those sense of personal opinion out of the equation. So we don't ever have to worry that it's about one group thinking they're right and using their prayer to overcome somebody else's views. If we ever feel like that's what we're doing, we can stop that. We'll know it's not right because it doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel like it's doing anything. It doesn't feel useful. We drop, though. We take a step back from all those opinions and fears, and okay, God, what do you know? What are you making? How do I reason out from there? Well, we've gone a few minutes over. Thanks for hanging in there for those few minutes over time. I'm gonna pause now, and I'm gonna go check out our question and answer box. At the moment, looks like nobody submitted anything, so that's totally fine. I'm just going to share this one last idea, and it comes back to the question of, how do I know my prayers do any good? Because as much as we've talked about tonight, there's a lot of angles on that, and I know that can feel heavy, especially when we're praying about stuff that's in the wider community. So here's another, going back to our math analogy of 7 and 3, okay? 7 and 3 equals 10, and we know that. But we also all know that 7 trillion and 3 trillion equal 10 trillion. Well, how do we know? Have you seen 10 trillion of anything? I haven't either. Not that I know of anyway. I wouldn't know how to quantify what 10 trillion grains of sand would look like, how much room that would take up, for example. But like you, I know with mathematical certainty that 3 and 7 trillion are 10 trillion. How do we know that? Well, we know it because of the principle, and we know that the principle is true on any scale. So we can prove in our lives 7 and 3 equals 10. We don't just have a blind faith in that. And then we know that the scale is really irrelevant. It doesn't matter if you call it thousands or billions or trillions, quadrillions or whatever. It's just the same principle. And so it's helpful when we pray about stuff in the community and in the country, in the world, that we have a sense of like just getting beyond, again, the surface level issues. For example, before I did the work I'm doing now, I worked in finance, and we would watch a jobs report come out. It would say 200,000 new jobs created in the U.S. this quarter, and people would be disappointed because they were expecting 300,000 new jobs, and then that day the market would go down. Well, why did it go down? Because of disappointment, because of expectations not met. Well, if you were praying about the economy that day, you might be praying about the number of widgets built and imported and exported, and what the tariffs are, and all those kinds of legitimately complex issues that surround that, the economy. But you might be missing the point of the number one factor that day was disappointment, or expectations not met. So as we go to pray about anything, part of what our prayer can do is take all the complexity and just help us really discern very thoughtfully, very intelligently, what are the mental elements involved here? Is it greed? Is it pride? Is it fear? Is it, what is it? Is it disappointment? Because whether it seems like something among two groups that have been going at each other for a long time, we can always get to, well, there are mental elements there that we all deal with in all of us. It's humanity. So what's the principle that helps me deal with that? For example, what helps me overcome pride or greed or fear? What is it that I'm learning about the nature of God that helps me get a better view of why I don't have to be afraid, why I don't have to run out and just try and get mine at the expense of other people? What is it that shapes my view that helps me have a sense of, if I'm really listening to what the nature of God is, then I will always know what to do in order to have my needs met. So I don't have to feel like I'm in a combat in a zero-sum game. Well, whatever I'm learning about that, there's a principle behind that. It's a fact of the universe. It's how things work for everybody. And I know that in as much as I'm actually experiencing it in my life. When, just really innovative ideas overcome fear and greed or selfishness or whatever, then I get to see the power of that. I get to see the tangible outcome and effect of discovering that true idea, reasoning out from it. And then I go, oh, I get it, cause and effect. This is the true idea that helps, counteract that falsity. There's actually no real substance or inevitability in those views, no matter how entrenched they seem. As the light dawns on that, I may have believed some fearful thought for 20 years. The moment I get a better view, I go, oh, I don't have to be afraid of that anymore. And I feel the freedom and I experience it. And so as we pray about these big picture things, getting clear about what are the mental elements involved and what is the principle, the true idea of God that helps deal with it. As I'm experiencing that in my life, I know it's like I'm proving the 7 + 3 = 10 equation. But then as I go to pray about it on a bigger scale, I say, well, there's those same elements again. And the way this has played out in my life has proven to me that this is actually a power. This principle is true. And therefore, I also know it's true on any scale. 7 trillion and 3 trillion is 10 trillion, just the same as 7 and 3 is 10. So when I go to pray, I don't have to wonder, how does my tiny prayer affect that big problem? It's, how does this fact of what things are on any scale deal with that misconception on any scale? And then the power is not in me, the power is in the principle. The power is in what it does and how it acts, in the hearts, in the thought, in the character, in the lives of anybody. Lots of people at once, or just a few people, or one person. Again, the woman who stood there in front of that audience that day wasn't trying to help 3,000 people. It could have been 3, it could have been 30,000. It wouldn't have mattered. It was the same principle of love and how love deals with mob mentality. And that's a broad brushstroke kind of a statement, but when you're looking at an issue, it gets more specific than that. Really rich, intelligent, detailed ideas that meet every little element of what seems to be going on. They come to us as we open up to that and discover more about it and what it means. We don't just have to hold the generic big ideas and feel like that's enough. Sometimes it is, but a lot of times it's, okay, I'll discover more and more and more. I know that there's always going to be a newness and a depth and a breadth and richness to that. And that's what makes it great. That's what makes every day really kind of a joy to discover more about God and God's nature. And then again, we know that the effect that has on any scale is relevant because it's a principle. It's a principle that applies on any scale. I'm going to read you just a couple last lines here in the Bible and in Science and Health, and then we're going to wrap up tonight. So first, two things from the Bible. First is from Paul in 1 Corinthians, and he says, now we see things imperfectly, like puzzling reflections in a mirror, but then we will see everything with perfect clarity. All that I know now is partial and incomplete, but then I will know everything completely, just as God now knows me completely. So again, it feels like there's this distortion mixed in with all the goodness that we see in the world, but that distortion doesn't affect what the goodness really is. And what God sees and what God knows and what God is doing is what is. That's the clear view. It's the facts. And so he's saying we will also know that, and step by step, just gently, naturally, but persistently, and often much quicker than we think, as we're really wholeheartedly yearning and seeking and reasoning out from the clearest basis possible, we see more of that view. We see more from God's view, and that leads us forward. One last line here from Paul. Later in 2 Corinthians, he writes, "See, now is the acceptable time. See, now is the day of salvation." So again, if we're thinking a little bit of salvation as like that discovery that nothing can separate us from the love of God, he's saying it's now. Now's the time. Every moment, moment by moment. It's not just we get a piece of the puzzle as much as we get all that we need right now. And then in the next moment, all that we need right now. Now is the time to discover that nothing can separate us from the love of God, and to experience that, and to build on that, and to let that just continue to unfold. The last line here then is from Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures by Mary Baker Eddy. And she writes, "It's possible, yea, it's the duty and privilege of every child, man, and woman to follow in some degree the example of the Master by the demonstration of truth and life, of health and holiness." So it's built into us. It's God-given. It's grace. Every moment. It's what truth and love do and how they define our nature and our capacity. Every moment able to reason out from that and to experience that health, wholeness, holiness, goodness all around us. It's not too much to ask. It's not about having our head in the clouds. It's not about just pretending that it's there. It's about really genuinely discovering it. And we know it. We know it when we discover it. It's just all that we need in this moment. And again, moment by moment, working soberly, practically, intelligently out from that standpoint, and empowered by it, not by some power of our own. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to be part of this tonight. I see that a number of you wrote comments. Thank you so much. I'll read those in a moment. But I really appreciate being able to join with you, to think through these things with you. Grateful for the group in West Vancouver who brought us all together tonight and is there as a resource in their community. The folks that I know in that group that I've been talking with that are really praying about a number of issues in the community. It's been great to be part of this with you, and I'm grateful for each of you, whoever you are, wherever you are, just grateful for you letting that light shine through your life. So Have a wonderful rest of your evening, and take good care.